And Martha, you touched on a question that I had, so I've got two good follow-up questions. But JT, I'm curious before I jump into those. Anything you wanted to ask before I dive into those?
No, it's not so much a question as it is just feeling exposed by two white guys hosting a podcast about running.
Oh,
So that's
yeah.
great.
You know,
And
I also want to add just that, the brands coming together. It is really, really cool. And, Brooks and Hoka are competitors, but we're really coming together to make change for the greater good and for the running industry itself, right? To just make it that much more better. I think that, Brooks alone, we can look at ourselves and we can make change, but um, we can have influence on the industry, but the only way that the industry is going to change is if we all work together.
yeah, yeah, and I think one of the things that helps, and JT, you kind of alluded to this a little bit, but there's part of this is like there's a unconscious bias that defines the perception of accessibility that's out there for running. It's this idea where you just need a pair of shoes and head
Yeah.
out the door, and you're good. And even those things, right, can be a massive barrier. Whether it's being able to have footwear that you can use outside, it's being in a safe environment where you can feel like you're able to go for a run, and that doesn't that could be as a woman just feeling safe in to go outside and go for a run when it's dusk or the middle of the day. You know, I don't feel that, but someone else might have a different experience in the very same neighborhood. But what I'm hoping to hear maybe from Martha, since you touched on this, one thing is, can you help outline a few of those barriers that might break down some of those unconscious biases that we, particularly as a white male, might have in terms of accessibility, and as it relates to to not just the participation in mass events, but just getting outside and going for a run.
Yeah, well, you touched on a few of those, right? Like the idea of being safe and feeling safe. Like that's a huge barrier for some people. I can use myself as an example. I do not run when the sun's going down or if it's not bright outside. And oftentimes I prefer to run indoors on a treadmill. I really like to just be alone. Like that's the type of runner that I am. I'm not big on the community or large events. I really like to have that and use it as like my meditation and be aware of the thoughts in my head, but that means that I need to go out alone, and there's a fear that comes with that. So I think that's one big piece of safety that oftentimes women experience, is not having that privilege to have that. I could tell you my husband's a trail runner and he never even thinks about that. So and when I brought that up to him, he was like, what do you mean you worry? Why would you worry about that? So I had to go through this whole conversation with him. I'm like, no, there's this genuine fear that a lot of folks feel of going out alone. So I think that's one piece. I think also, not having access to different information. So there's a lot of people that don't know that there are certain, specialty access points where you can go in and get fitted for footwear, or they could provide you free information on what type of footwear could best serve you. And I think these are different pieces that oftentimes we don't think about. And I think, there's a lot of self-awareness work that has to happen for each individual when you're kind of either in a brand or doing work of DEI, of just kind of recognizing your own privileges that you have with this work. But I think those are a couple just examples.
Yeah, those are great. I appreciate sharing those. And I know JT, as someone who puts on big events, like one of the thoughts that just in the economics of big events, I guess the question for you is like, there's a number of folks that you need to have to return every year to
Right.
make an event feasible, but you also have to continue to ensure that you're being welcoming enough for individuals to enter into it for the first time.
Yep.
Are there any things that you're thinking about? And I'm kind of throwing you on the spot as an event
No.
organizer, where how do we make this more just open, accessible, and welcoming to people who might be experiencing it for the first time in a community that quite honestly might not look like them.
Yeah. Well, the opportunity is amazing, right? We're talking about 31% of the, I think Shannon said, of the running population. It could be you add 20% to that, or you start to increase that percentage of people of color running in our industry, and it changes numbers for everybody here, whether you're selling shoes, apparel, or whatever it's going to be. But in terms of a strategy for opening this up, we've been thinking a lot about it from the pandemic perspective, where it's not just a strategy of diversity, it's a strategy of new people coming to running all together that have not had their gyms to go to, have not had a studio fitness to go to, and all these things. And I think as a strategy, the same strategy we're applying to the pandemic can be applied to increasing diversity, which is just taking like the thinking out of it, or the questions out of it, and trying to make it as easy as possible to get into the sport. So almost like running 101, or, you know, I'm afraid to ask these questions because that industry doesn't look like it's for me, or something like that. Somehow just opening the floodgates. So I think that's the conversations we're having inside of Soul Focus and Run Local, which is how do we make this as easy as possible, and to eliminate the what is the word I'm looking for? It's like the it's not competitiveness, it's the like intensity. I just want to make it fun and accessible to everybody, and that goes through everybody.
Yeah, and I think maybe what you're hinting at too is there's a lot of times there's a balance of like personal bests or time or some sort of objective measurement over what should be a subjective adventure for individuals. And you know, we've all done this where we've gone on a run and we think, oh, I just ran that really fast, so that must have X amount of value better than something that I ran slow.
Yeah.
You're kind of like, why?
Yeah.
what's the
But it's
point?
for me, or that could be for me. And
Yeah.
I think it helps a lot by seeing people who look like you doing that sport.
Yeah.
So that's massive.
That goes back to the representation piece, right? And you know, one of the barriers that we look at is social emotional, and this idea of, it's a little bit of like self-esteem, like, am I a runner? Like, maybe I'm not a runner. I am a slow runner. So I've like personally, I've struggled with this idea of like, am I really a runner if I'm only running a 11 or 12 mile, you know, minute mile.
Right.
And especially working in the industry and for a running company where people are so competitive, and there are some really fast runners that I work with every day. So, you know, that piece about if you can see somebody like yourself that is a runner, and maybe they're not a 5-minute mile, you know, so maybe they're not stick thin.
Yeah.
They're still a runner.
Yeah. I just wanted to add that piece is so important, what Shannon just touched on, especially working within the industry. I mean, I worked in fashion footwear for 8.5 years before I found myself in the outdoor and running industry. And through that, there were, especially when I first discovered the HOKA brand 5 years ago, I was really intimidated by every single person that worked for the brand. I was so scared to go on any runs with people. It was really intimidating. So I just kind of went through my own kind of personal, and I use myself of like, there must be other consumers who feel this way, where they're just so scared, where like you have all of these expectations, like you need to have this type of shoe, this type of apparel, this, all of these things, you need to check all of these things off, and you need to be able to run and also talk with everyone and hold a conversation. Like even that piece is real. Like that was things that I was going through in my head where I felt so intimidated. And like Shannon, there's a lot of amazing runners. They're all super competitive. Love working with them. But personally for me, like that's just not
hard to
the
relate
type
to.
of runner. Yeah, it's not the type of runner that I am. I grew up playing soccer. So yes, I can, you know, in a soccer match run 7 to 9 miles, but that's not what I'm thinking about. But I think that representation piece and showing the diversity in the running industry, it's the 5-minute mile, and it's the 11 and 12 and 15. And it's also people that run and walk at the same time. And that's all fair. They're all runners. They're all athletes.